Remembering Howard Zinn. He died yesterday at the age of 87. Zinn was a historian, a playwright, and a social activist. But most people regarded him as the people's president, a true American patriot. I actually brought my copy of People's History of the United States today. This is a prized possession for a lot of people, and I'm going to talk about this today with a guest, Dave Zirin, a correspondent at The Nation magazine. Dave, you knew Howard Zinn personally. Talk to us a little bit about his story.
Was just an incredibly kind person with a heart that was big enough for all of the hundreds of people, thousands of people who would come see him speak. I have to say, looking at the dog-eared copy of A People's History, it looks just like mine, in that it looks well used and well loved. It says 500,000 sold on the top. The sales of his book are now over 2 million. The first print run was 5,000 copies. I mean, this has been a ground-up life of Howard Zinn, and people loved him and responded to him because he was authentic. When he spoke about poverty, he spoke from the perspective of somebody who worked in the shipyards as a teenager during the Great Depression. When he spoke against war, he spoke from the perspective of someone who was a bombardier in World War II, something that changed his life forever and changed his outlook on the world. When he spoke against racism, he spoke from the perspective of someone who was a professor at Spelman College, historically black college for women in Georgia, where his students were people who just loved him, people like Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple, Marion Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund. I mean, these were his students, and he would get arrested with them when they would go sit in. So he was somebody who people just knew was genuine. He was theirs. And
Howard Zinn was 87 years old, as we mentioned, and we never saw him sort of as a talking head on cable news channels. He wrote books, and he wrote plays, and yet, when he would go to speak, there would be packed audiences, packed houses of followers, people who respected him. Why was this?
Because he told the people's history. Like people, I spoke with Howard several times, and the crowd would be packed with families, black, white, brown, grandparents bringing their grandchildren. It was a remarkable thing. And they came to see him because he would take their histories and make them humorous and heroic. And that's what Howard Zinn did. He did nothing less than rewrite the narrative of history in the United States. His impact is indescribable, and his loss is terrible. And I have to say, how often are you ever shocked by the death of an 87-year-old? I mean, his life force was still so strong. He was out in California to do another talk. I mean, his health, his flesh was failing, no question, but his spirit and his mind were as sharp as ever. I mean, the loss is incalculable. People's hearts are broken today. And when do you ever hear that about somebody 87, people being shocked that they're no longer with us?
And he wasn't sitting in a rocking chair. He was swimming in a pool.
Swimming in a pool.
Getting ready to go speak.
Yeah, he was going to speak. He had a packed event set up. He was making dinner plans that night. I mean, this was Howard. He was joking around about being glad not to be in Boston to get away from the cold, and this is who he was. He had a love for life and a love for people, which I feel like we can only learn from.
Just very briefly, talk to me about what you think some of his greatest contributions were.
Well, his greatest contribution was actually, I think, teaching a whole generation of people, actually generations of people, and I include myself in these generations, to love history and to claim history. I mean, I grew up hating history in high school. All I knew was that the Magna Carta was in 1215, and I couldn't tell you what the Magna Carta was, but I knew it was in 1215. It was dates, it was dry, it was a series of great men in powdered wigs. Howard Zinn took history, turned it on its head. He said, no, history is about runaway slaves. History is about women who dared to be wild in the 19th and 18th century. History is about labor activists bucking convention and fighting for their rights. And he made us all feel like we could be subjects of history as opposed to history's victims. That's who Howard was. He empowered us, and that's why his loss is felt so strongly.
All right. Dave Zirin, thank you so much for joining us. Dave Zirin is a correspondent with The Nation magazine.